Welcome to Inside Crime, the Experts. In this series, we'll bring you updates on what is making the news in the crime genre in Australia and around the world. Our experts will take you inside some of the most challenging crimes and mysteries. Many of these are unsolved. They're the stories of serial killers, murders, organised crime, disappearances, scams, frauds and heists. And now to our experts. Tim Watson-Munro is Australia's leading criminal psychologist. He's delved into the minds and crimes of some of the most notorious criminals in Australia and around the globe. Dr. Xanthi Mallet is a world-renowned criminologist and Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Newcastle. And lastly, I'm Duncan McNabb. I started my life of crime as a detective in policing and criminal defence and in the corporate sector before heading to the media as an investigative journalist, author and documentary maker. First up, some extraordinary developments in the Easey Street murder case. This is an unsolved double homicide that took place 47 years ago. On the 10th of January 1977, friends Suzanne Armstrong, then 28, and Susan Bartlett, then 27, were murdered in the home they shared on Easey Street in Collingwood, an inner-city Melbourne suburb. Both victims had been stabbed to death and one of the women had been raped. 3 days later, their bodies were found by neighbours. In addition, they found Ms. Armstrong's 16-month-old son still in his cot, distressed, hungry and dehydrated, but thankfully unharmed. A massive manhunt ensued and there were literally hundreds of people on a list of potential suspects. Not uncommon in cases like this, but there were no arrests. This terrible crime became a cold case. And now, 47 years later, almost half a century, a man, Perry Carombolas, has been detained. This was on the 19th of September this year at Rome's Leonardo da Vinci Airport. And now to our experts, Xanthi and Tim, for their insider's view of this remarkable development.
There was a massive manhunt which followed the crime. Hundreds of suspects were interviewed. Nobody was questioned or arrested, I should say. And one person on that list was Perry Carombolas. He was then 17 years of age. Coincidentally, 40 years later, in 2017, on the anniversary of the murders, the Victorian government posted a reward for $1 million. And at the same time, Carombolas was asked to provide a DNA sample. And what happened then was he decamped to Greece. I'm not saying anything about that. He's entitled to the presumption of innocence. But the police evidently then sat on the case for a protracted period of time. They had a strong idea about who the offender might be, but because of complicated extradition laws and statute of limitation issues in Greece, they couldn't arrest him there. They waited until he travelled to Rome and he was picked up at the Leonardo da Vinci Airport.
He was pulled over about a week after the murders took place and he had a knife in the boot, I think it was in the boot of his car, which was taken by police. It was tested, it did have blood on it, but we're talking 1977. So DNA is not what it is now. They wouldn't have been able to individuate, but they knew that it was blood. They could tell that. But he wasn't really a suspect. So at the coronal inquest into the double murder, the coroner and others seemed to accept that he'd actually found the knife, as he claimed, on a train track, I believe. So he wasn't looked at that closely, I think, until later in the investigation. And then, as you say, Tim, 2017, he becomes a person of interest, is asked to donate DNA. And for whatever reason, a presumption of innocence, he may have had any number of reasons to not do it and leave for Greece. However, he didn't provide a sample. More recently, a close family member has provided a sample to determine if there's a link between the accused and the crime scene. And we can only assume that that's part of the brief of evidence to get him arrested in Rome.
I'm going to say one of the interesting side stories to this story is that the young constable who picked him up back then in his divisional van was none other than Ron Iddles, who ended up being the head of the Victorian Police Homicide Squad. And Iddles questioned him. He passed the information on. It was never, it would seem, acted upon, even though there was a knife. And yet, you know, here we go, 47 years later, Iddles' career, you know, peaked. He was head of the homicide squad. He's now retired. But I just thought it was an interesting twist to the story.
And it's often the case in these very large-scale manhunts is that the person you who may appear years later as a suspect, like Christopher Wilder, for example, we were talking about a while ago, always question that first tranche of the investigation, but no further evidence to push him further up the suspect list or to eliminate him. So they just sit there. And then things like DNA come along. And isn't it fantastic that the crime scene forensics from back in 1977 were well preserved and could actually yield DNA matches? Technology has caught up with it. Quite often in police work, these exhibits disappear or they get knocked around a bit, so they're not usable. Fantastic news to see that the Easey Street exhibits are still in good, usable condition, and they've led to this breakthrough.
And that they may be contaminated. We don't know how they were collected, how they were stored, because they just wouldn't have understood anything about DNA preservation, contamination, prevention, any of that. And so it's really remarkable that exhibits still exist that could at least lead to this progress, because 47 years is a bloody long time in science.
1977 was the year I started as a copper, 47 years ago, and we wouldn't have known what DNA was. No one had even heard of it. It was the stuff of science fiction, if we'd heard of it at all. Now, these days, it's become commonplace. And the use of familial DNA is a similar sort of technique was used to track down Joseph DeAngelo, that remarkable moment in criminal investigation where they've kept all the exhibits from the, in this case, 70s and 80s. A bright copper has noted recently that there's this new genetic genealogy. Put an old sample in. Around about the same time, a family member of DeAngelo's has decided to trace his own ancestry, popped into ancestry.com or one of those data.
Did match, I think it was in that case.
Yeah, and at some point, rather than getting a report on where his family came from, they got a knock on the door, presumably from coppers. How does this genetic genealogy stuff work?
It's quite amazing, really. So people upload a sample, normally a buccal swab, so a cheek swab, upload it to one of these, they send it in, the profile gets processed, uploaded to the database, and then you can go in and you can basically trace your family tree. Anyone who links to you genetically will show up in your tree. And police can actually upload samples, unknown samples, and actually see who comes back in that particular database, a GEDmatch in the DeAngelo case, and see who is linked to them, no matter how remotely. And people are uploading all the time. Remember, thousands of samples being uploaded all the time. So, and it just happens that a fairly close match in the DeAngelo case came up. They then narrowed down further down to individuals that they were interested in as persons of interest, followed DeAngelo, and actually then took a covert sample. I think he discarded, I think it was a coffee cup or something. He was drinking, he threw it away. They collected that and did a one-to-one match with the crime scenes. Babing is identified as an incredibly prolific murderer, sex offender, burglar. Oh, the list went on with him, didn't it? So that's basically they're mixing that genetic history with advanced DNA technologies to narrow down suspect pools.
It's sort of revolutionising the way we can also deal with cold case crimes.
Yep, absolutely.
In New South Wales last week, the government have accepted all the 19 recommendations for the Gay Hate Crimes Special Commission. In those recommendations, and it impacts on all unsolved murders in New South Wales, is a recommendation that police go back to day one, check the forensic materials they've kept in each and every case, and see if technology can suddenly put that last piece in the puzzle.
And we are beginning to use genetic genealogy or forensic investigative genetic genealogy, shortened to FIG for ease, in Australia. It's been used in some unidentified deceased cases as well. Slightly different to the Easey Street evaluation of the DNA in that was a familial match, in that a close family member, I won't say, I don't know if it's been confirmed formally how close, so I'll just steer away from that one, but a very close family member donated their DNA. They were asked to donate a sample because the police couldn't access the accused's DNA. So they went to a very close family member and said, can we have your DNA to determine if that match from the crime scene could in fact belong to your family member? So it's a slightly different thing. It wasn't an open search. It was still a close familial search. So slightly different. And for people who wonder whether like FIG can get it wrong, for example, any forensic technique can go wrong. But the thing with FIG is that once a person is narrowed down as a suspect or person of interest in a case, the police do all of their standard forensic practices. They will collect that primary DNA to compare to the crime scene. You would never identify somebody purely on the basis of forensic investigative genetic genealogy. It's a lead generation tool So that's what they use to narrow a suspect pool and then follow up with all of the standard techniques that you would see applied in any other investigation.
Used in Canada with great success a couple of years ago, the case of Samuel Johnson. And it was a 40-year-old homicide. 2 women were murdered, sexually abused, no suspects at all. And then 40 years on, using genetic genealogy, they managed to locate this guy living in the northern regions of Ottawa, I think. He was arrested, he was charged and ultimately convicted of second-degree murder, doing life with a minimum of 21 years. So it's a bit of a global phenomenon. And one of the things I've been saying, and I think Zath too, in the interviews we've done about Easey Street, is that you can run these days, you can't hide anymore. And I think there's a lot of people out there who'd be quite nervous because of these developments in science and detection and so on.
Yeah, and who knows what's coming next? We've got these amazing techniques which are getting more uptake in Australia. Like FIG is very common in the US, and they're getting cold case solves every week, like 40, 50 years old. And so it's familial DNA with the Easey Street killings. But, these are opportunities now for the police to really make great strides with some of these investigations, which appeared previously to be unsolvable.
And as an adjunct to that as well, it also means that our authorities, police in particular, and forensic scientists can also use the same technology to identify previously unidentified human remains.
Absolutely. Yeah, very powerful in that space.
Bring some finality to people who've lost somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. And
where could it go wrong though? I mean, it's not infallible, Zath, right? There are failings with its technology.
You know what? Nothing is infallible. So if we look at familial DNA testing, for example, then you may do a familial match. So as in the Easey Street murders. So they went to a family member and said, we'd like your DNA. And that could possibly include somebody in the suspect pool, but it wouldn't necessarily exclude them, because with DNA, there's always the option that family trees are not what we think they are. And actually, one of my good friends, she found out she had a half brother. Her dad had another whole family, because somebody did ancestry.com thing and somebody contacted her and said, oh, I'm your half sibling. Your dad had another family. She didn't know. So what I'm saying is familial links are not necessarily transparent. Somebody who may think they're a sibling, for example, may not in fact be a sibling. And so you still got to treat these details and these outcomes with caution, and what it means particularly in that investigation. So yeah, things can go wrong, but no single technique should ever lead to a conviction, in my opinion. So it shouldn't just be just a DNA match, a fingerprint match. It should be a combination of different evidence types which all support each other to reach a sound and secure outcome.
On the flip side, and putting on my defense hat, there are some cases where DNA, the technology has been absolutely fabulous, but the interpretation is where the problem came in. A couple of cases come to mind. First up, there was a bloke in Perth some years ago. He had been arrested for PCA. They'd taken a DNA swab as part of the driving under the influence of alcohol. He'd been given a DNA sample. He'd been arrested, blah, 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 processed, all fine. A couple of blocks down the road from him, some years beforehand, there had been an absolutely appalling, brutal murder. They'd kept a lot of forensic material from the murder. This bloke had later been arrested because they'd matched him to the crime scene. All fine. Police would think it's a great job. But they hadn't done the basic backups to it to make sure that he could have been there at the time the crime happened. And obviously he couldn't. He's in jail, scratching his head, wondering what the heck is going on with his life. It looks like the forensic lab has managed to accidentally blend the crime scene with the PCA materials, just improper handling.
Yep,
and
contamination.
Yeah, and he then walked out the door of jail thinking after 18 months.
It can happen at so many stages along the handling, processing, lab errors. I've even heard of a case where somebody was prosecuted because they had 2 people in the database with the same name, and they just prosecuted the wrong one. There's
a bloke I know in Sydney, Robert de Heredia, Rob was extradited from the UK. To face charges for a bombing in Sydney. A personal trainer called Brett Boyd picked up a package allegedly delivered by Australia Post outside his house. Package got to waste tape and went bang. Brett lost a thumb, his eye, and a few other bits and pieces. An awful, awful crime. Could have been infinitely worse. On the package were 2 postage stamps, or 2 or 3 postage stamps. On the back of the postage stamps, they did a DNA test and they found DNA that was Rob d'Iradia's. But the question was, how did it actually get there? And what the defence were capable prove in a whole suite of things, the defence proved that the prosecution couldn't put Robert d'Iradia and the postage stamps actually at the crime scene, actually on the bomb. There was some sort of suggestion that may have been a bit of police malfeasance on the way through. So whilst the technology...
Well, that'd be the first time, sure.
Yeah, not the first. Well, the gentleman, one of the arresting officers at the time, later went to jail for all sorts of bits and pieces along the way. It's a very murky case. But in this case, and what it highlighted for me is the technology, remarkable, but it's the people handling the technology can sometimes have some issues.
This technology can also be used to acquit people. And you've discussed that in a way, but there's been some celebrated cases, for example, in the USA, where people have been on death row and they've been released after decades in jail, totally innocent. And the only thing that's been between them and the lethal injection or the electric chair has been this DNA technology.
Yep, and a number of the innocence projects or innocence initiatives in the US actually only deal with DNA cases. So these are often cases where DNA wasn't available at the time, or that they want the DNA rerun, reanalyzed to demonstrate that they believe their client is not in fact guilty. But there's no actual right for the accused to be able, to access that DNA sample, to have it re-evaluated. So they have to get special permission. But you're right, people have, been proven to be not guilty who are about to be executed. One of the big arguments against execution, because regardless of how sound a conviction can look, and look at Kathleen Folbig, for example, everyone believed that she was undoubtedly guilty of 3 murders and manslaughter. And yet science later goes, actually, we were wrong. And there's always that risk that can happen with DNA and any other technique. Nothing is infallible.
Shaken baby cases we were talking about.
Oh, yep.
Where the expert gives absolutely state-of-the-art evidence about a decade beforehand, then comes up a few years later, and this is a case in Boston, the famous case of the nanny, and then turns, I think her name was Louise Woodward from memory. Then
sounds good. Yeah, sounds about right.
The doctor turns around and says, contemporary science, I've reevaluated, I think I was wrong.
Yep. But all you have to do as an expert is be up to date in the knowledge at the time. Obviously, we don't have crystal balls. You can't be expected to predict what is going to be learnt later, what techniques are going to evolve, what research is going to be done. But at the time, you can fundamentally believe that that is honest evidence with integrity and it's reliable. But later, there's the potential that it could actually be wrong and misleading, and wrong people are going to prison, and people who are guilty are being found not guilty. It can go in both directions.
And that's in part why we need review mechanisms to review cases in light of contemporary science.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, back in Rome, the next step for the Australian authorities, now that Mr. Karamboulos has been detained and is currently, I think, not on bail, is in a prison in Rome.
And very uncomfortable, apparently.
Mr. Karamboulos is in jail. The next step is extradition. The Victorian Commissioner has said it will be a slow process. Even if he agrees, there's a lot of legal manoeuvrings to go through. And I've had some experience with one a few years back. These involve the local police, the investigators who are on the scene. They involve the Australian government more broadly, and they involve the Italian government and the Italian courts. It's a very complicated thing to put together. I don't think it'll be quick.
No, but he has actually agreed to the extradition. So yeah, he's given a no comment interview so far. The only thing he said is that he wants to get back to Australia and agrees to the extradition. So that will expedite it. It's still all of that political and legal wrangling to go through, but less than if he was fighting it, and that he's not guilty. And that's all he said so far. So it will be quicker than if he was trying to fight that extradition. But he says he wants to come back and clear his name, that he's not guilty.
Hopefully he'll be back before Christmas then.
Well, I think he may hope so, because apparently he's very uncomfortable in that Roman prison and it's very cold. And I think he's hoping to get back to Australia because he's got family here too. He doesn't have any family in Rome. He's got a brother in Athens. And so no support network in Rome either.
I don't think they'd be sending him back to Greece, that's for sure.
No, he won't be going back to Greece, no.
I suspect in his future will be a one-way ticket to Melbourne.
Yes, Yes. And at that point, he will face, if the extradition is successful, he will face the charges in a Victorian court. So he's arrested, but he's not charged with anything. He certainly hasn't been found guilty of anything. And there's a long legal road ahead, no matter what happens now.
Yeah, he's got to be brought back here. He's got to be arraigned. He's got to be formally charged. He's got to go through the lower court committal proceedings.
Committals, yeah.
Service a brief of evidence, and then if it proceeds up to the Supreme Court for discuss what's going to happen.
So we're probably talking 2026 before he would reach the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we're in the very, very first steps
At
of
least.
the road.
At least.
It's
look there, and the alleged mushroom killer, alleged.
She's up for trial on the 28th of April 2025, but that's not set in stone either.
And it's all been very hush-hush. The reason you haven't heard about it is because this is Victoria and everything is embargoed, isn't it?
Yeah, Victoria is the land of the suppression order, but by legislation, we can't report what's happened in court recently. We could report the lower court stuff, that's fine, but there have been some directions hearings, for want of a better term, in Victoria, which we are precluded from reporting on. And that's in addition to the normal sub judice things, the things that might be prejudicial to the case. So bottom line is we can't say anything apart from the trial will probably start at the end of April 2025 in country Victoria.
And when it goes to trial, will the press be able to report on it then, or will it still be under suppression?
Well, it depends on whether the judge puts a suppression order on what's happening in court, which doesn't happen that often. I'm a bit of a fan of open justice and, open. In the normal run of things, most of the evidence should be heard by the public in court and reportable, but that's only after the trial commences. The preliminary stuff that we're going through at the moment, we can't touch. That's just how Victoria works, different to the rest of Australia pretty much, but it's Victoria.
So that would be the same.
It'll be the same for Cromulus.
Yep.
The same suppression orders may apply to him if and when he's returned to Victoria.
Open justice in Victoria isn't quite as open as most of the other parts of Australia, unfortunately, but that's the way they run their show, so we're stuck with it.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to watch going forward, the bits we can hear, and ultimately if it gets to court or not, and we're still a very long way off on that.
Yeah, we're years away from a decision.
So what we do know, I mean, the family are very appreciative of Victoria Police for pursuing this case, so many decades later now. And ultimately, hopefully they're closer to getting answers, resolution, if never closure. We know that families never speak of closure. And obviously, Suzanne Armstrong left behind a son who will want to know what happened to his mother and why. And hopefully we're a step closer to being able to provide some of those answers now.
Full marks to Vic Pol and the DNA testers to achieve this really monumental breakthrough, isn't it? Where it goes, who knows? He's entitled to the presumption of innocence, but certainly there seems to have been some strong developments arising out of this technology.
Yeah, we live in extraordinary times, and this technology impacts on so many of the cold cases. Bring it on, I say. Anything.
Absolutely. I can't wait to see where it's, what genealogy and familial DNA testing is going to do for cold cases, and being used more up front as well. So not waiting till a case is cold, not waiting till the last resort. These technologies are available now early on in investigations, and they can really help progress them and reduce person of interest pools, suspect pools to help the police hone in on potential suspects. So it's a brave new world and an exciting one.
And it's a great time for governments to start writing bigger checks so we can do more of these.
I would bloody love that. Yes, it is.
Let's not kill the joy with funding, but we need more money for it.
Yep, we absolutely do. Yep.
Thanks again to Tim and Xanthi, and thanks everyone for watching Inside Crime, the Experts. Originally, this episode was going to be about serial killer couples, but the extraordinary developments in the Easey Street murders meant we put that to one side briefly to discuss what happened in Easey Street. Now, in our next episode, we will be discussing that very, very rare and deadly beast, couples who kill together, and talking particularly about UK's Fred and Rose West and Australia's David and Catherine Burney. Now, while both males are dead, Rose West and Catherine Burney are both alive, both in their early 70s and both still thankfully in prison. Thanks everyone for watching Inside Crime, the Experts. See you next time, and please like our channel and please subscribe. Thank you.